Hello, and welcome back to the Nostalgic Futurist podcast. This week, we are looking at Underground Disneyland. The top 10 secrets about Disneyland from David Koenig's book, Mouse Tales. Main Street, USA. Now, we all know that Main Street has hidden speakers to pump in the music, and hidden smellitizers to give us the sense of vanilla or peppermint or anything to draw us into the Candy Palace. But did you know that Main Street was specifically built to not only be Main Street as we remembered it, but Main Street as it should have been? Walt insisted on not having sharp angles anywhere on Main Street, so all of the curbs are rounded to give it a more nostalgic and friendly feel. Even buildings with columns that would normally be thick and domineering on buildings have been thinned down to make them feel more whimsical and less like a building with power and more like a building that you want to go visit and doesn't feel scary. Now, we all know about forced perspective, the idea that is used in film and architecture to make things appear that they are further in the background or closer than they may appear. Now, Main Street itself has its own form of forced perspective on each floor of the building. The first floors are 9/10 scale, and the second floors are 7/8. And if they have a third, it's 5/8 scale. 5/8 scale is the most popular scale used in Disneyland. It's used for the Mark Twain, the Disneyland Railroad, and all of the Main Street vehicles. The reason why 5/8 scale is used rather than using things like the train or the Mark Twain at full scale is 1, takes up less space, but 2, a full-sized locomotive train would be terrifying. If you were in a theme park and you had to step on to a full-size locomotive train, it would be louder, bigger, and feel a little bit too real. But a 5/8 scale train feels a lot more friendly and easy to use because it's not so domineering, just like the idea on Main Street. Did you know that some of the props on Main Street are actually the genuine artifacts from history? The cannons in Town Square are real cannons that were used back in the 1800s by the French army. The street lamps on Main Street are over 160 years old, and they were bought from the city of Baltimore to give Main Street a more authentic feeling. Adventureland. On the topic of real antiques, the Swiss family treehouse, now known as Tarzan's treehouse, was actually furnished with real antiques, including a 1700s barometer, muskets, a ship's wheel, and much, much more. Now, the Jungle Cruise wasn't always meant to be animatronic animals. In fact, at first, Walt wanted to try real animals on the Jungle Cruise, but zoologists had told him the animals aren't going to be super easy to see, they're going to want to sleep all day, and they're not going to be as entertaining and do the things you want as fake animals would. Well, Walt wanted to try real animals anyway. He rented alligators, real live alligators, from the old Buena Park Alligator Farm that was located near Knott's Berry Farm. These somewhat small-ish alligators were put in front of the Jungle Cruise entrance to help, entertain people in line. Well, the problem is with tourists and animals, and especially when they think that they're fake animals, they started throwing food and, toys and other little things into the cages, and the alligators would eat them. It was said that because the alligators make a natural hissing sound, guests thought that they were mechanical and therefore didn't feel bad about throwing objects into their pens. Now, the worst problem with the live alligators in pens was when they broke loose and got into the Jungle Cruise waters and began to terrorize guests and Jungle Cruise skippers alike. Eventually, after many, many times of Jungle Cruise skippers trying to pretend that there wasn't a live alligator currently in the waters, they decided to send the alligators back to where they came from and no longer have live animals on the Jungle Cruise. Speaking of live animals and the Jungle Cruise, there was a problem in the early years of Disneyland with rather large arachnids coming into fruition in the Jungle Cruise. Now, the Jungle Cruise banks are lined with a myriad of trees that may not necessarily be native to an actual jungle anywhere in the world. But the combination of the environment and the types of trees and the water and humidity gave way to allow spiders to grow to an alarming size. One Jungle Cruise skipper said that they were nickel to quarter-size spiders spinning webs everywhere in the jungle, in the queue, on the boats, and that oftentimes when skippers were giving their spiels, they would have to try to draw attention away from these large spiders spinning webs over the guests' heads so that people wouldn't freak out and try to abandon ship. Part of the daily Jungle Cruise maintenance was to go out into the jungle and into the boats and to shoot these spiders with little plastic shells in order to rid themselves of the problem. Frontierland. Now, on the topic of problematic insects, we're going to look at Frontierland's problems with flies. Now, Frontierland over time has had a lot of animals stored in its area / used as ride vehicles, in a way, if you think about the mules. And there was a pony farm that was located behind Fantasyland that, serviced several types of attractions around the park, and they had a fly problem. But what Disneyland did to get rid of them was to order special tiny flies that are apparently impossible for the human eye to see, that go and they eat the larvae of bigger flies, and therefore they annihilated that population, and there were no more flies buzzing around the ponies in Frontierland. But flies weren't the biggest problem, nor were nickel to quarter-size spiders. It was really rats. Yup, you heard me right. Disneyland didn't just have mice, it had rats. Now, of course, as we all know, if you've read or seen Charlotte's Web, rats love amusement parks. Popcorn and churro bits and maybe a little bit of a turkey leg, and rats are going to be hustling their bustle to get in there and get some food. Now, in the late 60s, there was a huge problem with rats on Tom Sawyer Island because at night there weren't as many guests and they could go to town chowing. Now, unfortunately for 2 cast members who were out on the island doing some regular evening maintenance, they got locked inside of shack with several of the large rats and had to call for help from raft operators who then came and disposed of the rats with their canoe paddles. Now, the rats were a big problem. Oftentimes cast members said that they would have to fish little baby rats out of the rivers of America or the Jungle Cruise to scoop them up in little cups and get rid of them. And Disney decided that they had to do something about the rats just like they did with the flies. So they began dropping hot dogs laced with cyanide to dispose of the rats. And unfortunately, a small child picked up one of those hot dogs one time and ate it and became violently ill. From that point on, that was no longer the solution for getting rid of rats. So Disney turned to rats' natural villain, cats. Disney brought in a bunch of feral cats to deal with the rat problem. Now, we've all heard about the Disney cats, the ever-elusive feral cats that live in Disneyland. I don't know about you, but anytime I see one, I'm always very excited and try to get them to come closer, but they are very, very shy. Frontierland is also home to many artifacts that are actually real antiques. Thunder Mountain itself is decorated with several, considering it used to be the ride Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland and now is Big Thunder Railroad. These objects include a stamp mill, an ore car, a drill press, and a giant winch motor. Now here's something you may not have known. Back in the early days of Disneyland, you could actually go fishing in the rivers of America. Disneyland poured in thousands of bluegill and catfish into the rivers of America and had a cast member dressed up as Tom Sawyer handing out worms, hooks, and fishing poles. Well, the fish ended up being another problem, just like most of the other live animals in Disneyland, as oftentimes people would catch fish and then just leave them around and there'd be just dead fish around. And when they tried to do a catch and release program, it didn't go well either. Disneyland was also worried that people might try to catch catfish and take them out of the water and take a little snack straight from the rivers of America. Fishing was quickly disbanded. New Orleans Square. I may be biased on this one, but I think New Orleans Square has some of the coolest secrets. It is by far the best land and also lends itself to the most amount of secrets. Now, every night in Disneyland, there are hundreds upon hundreds of cast members who come in to clean the park and to get it ready for the next day. This includes anything from hosing down sidewalks and sanitizing, changing out light bulbs, etc., etc., etc. But in the Haunted Mansion, cleaning has to take a different approach. Because the problem is with airflow from the air conditioning kind of blowing dust off of things and making them not look quite so old, they actually have to have cast members go in with bags of dust and put it all over things with a device that they say looks like a grass seeder. They also get to spray on imitation cobwebs, but in liquid form, which sounds kind of awesome. One of the biggest things that separates Disney World from Disneyland is the utilidors. When Disney World was built, they built an underground city so that cast members wouldn't be seen in the wrong land if they were dressed up as a cowboy and they were walking through Tomorrowland. And to help have a place for cast members to go on breaks, to have kitchens, and to have ways of delivering garbage around the park and things like that. Well, when they built New Orleans Square, Walt Disney realized that he needed more space. And so most of New Orleans Square's kitchens and other things like stock rooms are put together in tunnels underneath New Orleans Square, and they use elevators and stairways to get back up to the surface level. But let's talk about the biggest secret in New Orleans Square. Or shall we say the worst kept secret ever. Club 33. Club 33 was intended by Walt to be a place that he could take executives from people who are sponsoring attractions in Tomorrowland, or special guests who could come and share a really fancy, nice meal in a very old-fashioned looking parlor setting, and really get to know the people he was working with or was being sponsored by. Now, one of the weirdest things about Club 33 was an idea to have a microphone built into the chandelier which could overhear guests' conversations, to then allow cast members to serve people better based on the things they overheard. Like someone saying, "Man, I wish that the waiter would come by and give me more water." Then suddenly a cast member would be there with more water. And if it was something that needed to be answered, like someone being like, "Oh, do you guys know what day Disneyland opened?" Then a vulture in the corner would answer, because he had a speaker in his mouth that would say, "Oh, well, Disneyland was opened on July 17th, 1955. But it was decided that that was a little creepy, and they took out that feature of Club 33. Critter Country. When we look at a lot of Disney rides, they have this kind of layered plastery look. But have you wondered what they call this clay-like substance that they use to make all of these fake rocks and fake mountains? Well, it's called mud. All boulders, mountains, even the boats on Splash Mountain are actually made of this mud and are hand sculpted by Imagineers and then painted. Fantasyland. On a journey back into difficult animals in Disneyland, there used to be a black and white swan that used to live in the moat of Sleeping Beauty's castle, and they were gifts to Walt Disney from Mervyn LeRoy. However, the problem with swans is they're not as nice as they are pretty. They would often attempt to escape, and when guests tried to get close to them, Disney employees had to make sure that the guests stayed back because swans are known for biting. When the original swans died off, Disney then had to replace them, and so they would rent swans. Every 6 months they would get new swans. Toontown. When they were building Mickey's Toontown in Disneyland, the Imagineers wanted to make everything look cartoonish, weird, and not how we would normally construct buildings. So they built regular structures, but then put extra layers of plaster on top of that, and then they brought in some of the craftsmen from Disneyland Paris to hand sculpt and paint the plaster so that it looked like a cartoon world with huge extra curves on the buildings, things that don't look like they stack right, and other funny gags. It is said that the curve away from these initial straight walls is up to 3 feet to make it curve out and look cartoonish. Tomorrowland. Just like New Orleans Square, Tomorrowland also has sections of itself that are underground to make life in Tomorrowland easier. One of the biggest things that Tomorrowland needs to do is regulate water in the submarine lagoon. This is done by running electrical, steam, and water pipes along the walls and the ceiling of these tunnels underneath Tomorrowland, which honestly looks more science fiction-y than actual Tomorrowland does now. These tunnels are also used for access for maintenance and supplies for the submarines, as well as help for the kitchens, food preparation, dressing rooms, and other types of storage. In fact, back in the 1990s, the rocket rods queue actually went through part of this underground tunnel in Tomorrowland, as it took you from the old Circle Vision building, which is now Astro Blasters, underneath the pavement of Tomorrowland and back up onto the People Mover boarding area. Fantasmic. Because Fantasmic wasn't in the plans when Disneyland was built, the Rivers of America and Tom Sawyer Island had to undergo major renovation to make Fantasmic work. They started by draining the Rivers of America and dug 3 stories into the ground to build basically a basement. Then they put a stage and the cider mill that sits at the front of Tom Sawyer Island, which is where they have all of the sound system, projectors, lifts. It's basically where they hold all of the technology that makes Fantasmic look great. They had to also build a backstage area where they could have the barges and the boats sit while they waited to go on stage at the front of the Rivers of America. They had to get clever with hiding speakers and lighting equipment, so it is hidden in rocks, lampposts, and buildings around the Rivers of America to help make the show even more magical. They even use Fort Wilderness on Tom Sawyer Island as their dressing rooms for all of the performers who perform in Fantasmic. And all of this is controlled all by a stage manager and some other production people in a little room above Pirates of the Caribbean. Maintenance. While Disneyland may not be as big as Disney World, there is a lot of maintenance that has to happen oftentimes overnight to make sure the park is ready for tomorrow's guests so that they are getting just as good of an experience as the people the day before, the people the year before, and the people all the way back to the beginning. Disneyland has a policy when it comes to light bulbs where, to avoid having bulbs burn out, they will often replace them when they've hit 80% of their life expectancy as a light bulb. That way, they don't have to deal with guests seeing lights that have gone out. Some of the more surprising things that happen every night, people who have to spend a shift polishing all the brass on the carousel, as well as people are required to clean the snow on top of Matterhorn and even brush Monstro the whale's teeth. The plants of Disneyland change as often as the seasons, and often they are dug back up and replanted every season to make sure that Disneyland's landscaping stays up to date with the time of year and also changes so that when you visit from time to time, you're not experiencing the same landscaping every time. It is even said that Disneyland treats their plants and trees with hormones to keep their plants from growing beyond their designated space, and therefore reducing the need to trim and clip plants as often as people at home may need to. It is even said that they use chemicals on olive trees to make sure that they don't drop olives all over the ground and therefore make a mess. There are teams of professional divers who have to jump into all of the different bodies of water in Disneyland to handle underwater maintenance to make sure all of the rides are working, no matter how murky the water may be. There are even people who have to walk every track to check every bolt to make sure that there is nothing wrong at any point in the track, such as brakes or wear and tear. Disneyland even goes so far as to make sure that they do paint touch-ups every night. As of the writing of Mouse Tales in 2006, it was said that more than 20,000 gallons of paint were used a year to keep Disneyland looking as nice as it does. And they have to use large fans and heaters to make sure that all this paint gets dry by the next day when the park opens so that they don't have a repeat of Black Sunday. Back in the days when the shooting gallery actually used to fire pellets, they used to have cast members who would spend the night retouching all of the targets that had been chipped by the pellets. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope that you learned something about Disneyland that you did not know before, so that you can sound real smart the next time you go to Disneyland and you can tell people about the gigantic spiders that used to live in the Jungle Cruise. Next week, we will be talking about cast members. What they do, what they've gone through, and what it's really like to work at Disneyland. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.